Hello, this is Thea Newman, the Director of Solar Avis. In this video, I would like to give an update on the analysis of Scottish mortality figures in 2021. I would like to thank all of those who viewed and commented on the video I made on this topic a few weeks ago. That video was quite lengthy. I was prioritizing clarity over brevity, but I do appreciate that not everyone has the time to watch quite lengthy presentations. For this reason, this update will be split into 3 separate videos, and that way I hope it will be more digestible. In this first video, I will do a very brief recap of the clarification process that we used in the previous video to distill the trends in non-COVID deaths in Scotland over 2021, and then I will show you the update of that data from the Scottish Government updates over the past 3 weeks, and I will also look at the 5 categories of non-COVID cause of death. And I will end this video with a sort of partial summary of the total numbers of excess deaths in those different non-COVID death categories. The second update video, which I plan to make online in the next few days, will be a deeper dive into the weeks 21 to 43 of this year, which is approximately late May through to the end of October. That's a period that's important for reasons that will be clear from this video, and I will show you in the second video a surprising and possibly important observation. And then in the third and final update video, at least from early November, I will try to bring a lot of this together. In speaking about trends, we do need to distill from those trends some hard numbers that we can use to understand what's going on. And also from the trends, if they are sound statistically, we should feel comfortable making some predictions. And so I will be doing that in the third update video. So let me start with a brief recap of the contents of the previous video. The main point of the previous video was to look at trends in non-COVID deaths in Scotland over 2021. And I showed a 2-step clarification process by which one can distill those trends from the data produced by the Scottish Government. I will very, very quickly show you how that clarification process works. So here is a plot of the data produced by the Scottish Government. The upper purple curve shows weekly deaths in Scotland through 2021, and in that previous video that went up to week 40. For comparison, the light blue curve are weekly deaths in Scotland averaged over the period 2015 to 2019, and that provides a sort of baseline with which we can compare 2021 deaths. And finally, at the bottom here, we see COVID deaths in Scotland in 2021, which are built into this purple curve, but they're just shown in here so that you can have an understanding of the impact of COVID. So this is the kind of data that the Scottish Government publishes every week on their websites. Now what we're going to do is a 2-step process. First of all, we're going to subtract the blue curve from the purple curve, and on the next slide, if we do that, we now have a plot of weekly deaths in Scotland in 2021 relative to the 5-year average. If this curve is positive, it means that for a given week there were more deaths in that week this year compared to that week in a 5-year average of 2015 to 2019. Vice versa, if this curve is negative, it means there were less deaths in a particular week in 2021 compared to that 5-year average. Now this data is still hard to interpret though, because it has a lot of deaths from COVID built into it. So the second step of the clarification process is to subtract from this curve the red curve of the previous graph, which are the COVID deaths. So now in this next slide here, we have the result of that two-step clarification process. We have the weekly non-COVID deaths in Scotland relative to the 5-year average. And as far as we know, there were no COVID deaths in this 5-year period, so we are comparing like with like in this curve. What's particularly striking about this curve, and really it's the thing that's been interesting me all year and prompting me to make these videos, is the fact that, rather surprisingly and worryingly, this curve continues to increase. We can fit a straight line to this curve, and as we showed in the previous video, this has a high correlation coefficient and a very low so-called p-value. This means that it is highly statistically significant. This curve, this increasing trend, is highly unlikely to have arisen by chance alone. We can repeat this analysis for individual causes of death, and this was done in the previous video. These are non-COVID causes of death used by the Scottish Government. There are 5 of them: cancer, dementia and Alzheimer's, circulatory, which includes heart disease and stroke, respiratory, which covers serious lung disease, and then all other causes of death are put into this category called other. This does not include COVID. That's a separate cause of death used in this year and last year. Now we can do the same thing for each of these causes of death, which is to compare them to the 5-year average for that cause of death. And what we showed in the previous video is that for all 5 non-COVID causes of death, there is a statistically significant increasing trend over 2021. So that's a recap of the previous video. The summary that we produced, here's an excerpt from the summary from that presentation, that the weekly counts of non-COVID deaths in Scotland have been steadily increasing throughout the year for all 5 categories of causes of death. We tried to use this information along with some other analysis, which I'm not recapping here, about how that can inform our understanding of the drivers or the reasons underlying these increasing trends. We showed that it's very unlikely that what we're seeing is a seasonal fluctuation. We also said that because all 5 categories of causes of death are showing an increasing trend, it's very unlikely that what we're seeing is undiagnosed COVID sort of bleeding in to this non-COVID mortality data. That's highly unlikely. That leaves us then with these other possibilities. The one that I think is most likely, and was actually the thing that prompted me to even look at this data in the first place, is, are we seeing serious downstream health consequences of lockdown? Now that's a large combination of possible factors. Some of it's due to the effects of lockdown on people's lives. A lot of it will be due to the significantly decreased medical treatment and surveillance that people experienced during lockdown. So far fewer regular GP appointments and cancellation or long-term postponement of important medical diagnostic procedures. So we may be seeing the beginning of the effects of the lack of proper medical care over lockdown. Other possible causes for this increase in non-COVID mortality, perhaps what we're seeing are severe long-term effects of COVID. So for people particularly in vulnerable groups, the elderly, people with serious comorbidities, even though they may recover from COVID, they may have significantly worsened health as a result, and this very sadly in some cases may lead to premature mortality. And then another reason, which as I explained at length in the previous video, I was thinking about whether I should even include, but I decided it was important to include it for objective and courageous reasons. Possibly there may be downstream health consequences of mass vaccination in certain subpopulations. We, I think, need to hope and pray that this is not the case, given the large scale of the mass vaccination campaign, but it would be wrong of us to not even mention this as a possibility. We need to be brave and say it's okay, it's possible, we'll put it on the list, but I think we all need to hope and pray that this is not actually a driver of what we're seeing. Finally, there may be something completely unrelated to COVID or our response to COVID, and we should list that just to be complete. I've half scratched it out here though, because I do think that what we're seeing is most likely connected to COVID in one form or another. Let's now take a look at the updated analysis using the last 3 weeks of data from the Scottish Government. We'll see that with this additional data, we can get a bit more insight into the trends, both for the overall non-COVID deaths and the individual causes of death categories. So, starting again from the Scottish Government data, I've updated it here with the last 3 weeks, weeks 41, 42 and 43 for the 2021 deaths. Here's the 5-year average and COVID deaths, which you can see are sort of plateaued here at a not insignificant rate. Quickly, let's go through the two-step clarification process. So we subtract the blue curve from the purple curve. This gives us the weekly deaths in Scotland relative to the 5-year average. Here are the last 3-week update points. And the second step of the clarification, we subtract from this the COVID deaths. And so this gives us then the weekly non-COVID deaths in Scotland relative to the 5-year average. And you can see that the last 3 weeks indeed still have this concerning property that they are well above zero. So they're in excess of the 5-year average. And if we fit a straight line to this curve, it is very, very similar to the straight line fit that we obtained previously. So the trend basically is continuing up to week 43. Now, as a correspondent of mine pointed out, to his eyes, when he looked at this curve, he thought that really it has what you might call a dogleg character, meaning there's sort of a break. As this curve goes positive above zero, he felt that this was more of a plateau. So if we look at this, it's really noteworthy that since week 21, which is the week beginning May 24th, all 23 weeks subsequent up until the end of October, this curve is positive, meaning that the non-COVID deaths in Scotland for each of the last 23 weeks have been greater than the 5-year average. This really is a concern for two reasons. First of all, there are COVID deaths occurring at this time, and we're not including them in this data. Secondly, as I explained at length in the previous video, we do actually expect this curve to be negative throughout all of 2021 and probably negative for the next year or two after that. The reason being, very briefly, that 6,000 plus people very sadly died of COVID in 2020, another several thousand in 2021 to date. These generally are people in vulnerable groups such as the elderly or people with serious comorbidities. Therefore, very sadly, a not insignificant number of individuals in those groups would be expected to contribute to mortality figures this year and in the next few years. The fact that those individuals very sadly died prematurely of COVID means that we would expect to see a deficit in mortality figures this year and in perhaps the next 1, 2, possibly 3 years. So the baseline in a way is not really zero, but it's actually sort of a negative value, and perhaps in a later video I can even give you a simple estimate of what that would be, but we would expect this data typically to be negative. So for that reason, and for the reason that we are not including COVID deaths here, it's really quite concerning. Firstly, that this data is stubbornly increasing through the year, but secondly, that it has been above zero for 23 weeks in a row. So particularly in this second update video, I'm going to focus exclusively on this period. And just to highlight that, what we can do is actually fit straight lines to week 21 up till the present, and then those weeks previous to week 21. And you can sort of see this dogleg character, the break in the curve that's sort of occurring there. Now, just very briefly, looking at update of the last 3 weeks in the 5 non-COVID categories of causes of death, there's not much change in terms of the trend. In all 5 cases, we still have, over the entire 43-week period, statistically significant increasing trends of of mortality relative to the 2015-2019 baseline. What I would like to do, though, is just point out a couple of things about this data. First of all, we see with the respiratory data that although it has the steepest slope of all of these 5 data sets, I'm giving these slopes or gradients as they're called of these 5 curves, and you see respiratory has the steepest, it does seem to be plateauing over the most recent 2 to 3 months. So this curve, I would say, has definitely the character of an increase and then a plateau around the baseline, which in a way is quite reassuring. This significant deficit in respiratory deaths is, I think, an obvious consequence of the fact that people with serious respiratory illness would have been the most susceptible to dying of COVID last year and earlier this year, very sadly. So that curve, I think, has a very significant character that we can understand. The other curve I want to just draw attention to here, or the other data set, is this sort of miscellany category, other. Now this really includes many different causes of death. There'll be certain illnesses which are not included in these 4 broad categories, but there'll also be things like suicide, homicide, drug overdose, accident, so on and so forth. And what is very worrying, given the generic nature of this category of cause of death, is the following observation that you can see here, is that apart from 3 weeks in 2021, all of the other weeks show in this category that deaths in 2021 have been greater than the 5-year average. And I will say a little bit more about that in the summary, but that really is, I think, quite striking and really quite a significant concern. Let me now summarize that analysis. In particular, I want to pull out some key figures relating to that period weeks 21 to 43 concerning excess non-COVID deaths. In summary then, we have shown that in this update, non-COVID deaths continue to increase in Scotland relative to the 5-year average. Particularly concerning, we see that these non-COVID deaths have been in excess of the 5-year average for each week of the 23-week period, May 24th to October 31st. Now, what we can do is actually pull out some numbers from the data that I've shown you so far. I will be looking a bit more in detail at numbers in the update videos 2 and 3, but let me just give you a little bit of analysis to end this first update video. If I just go back one slide here, if we look at a particular cause of death, let's just take circulatory as an example. Let me focus on this period, week 21 through to 43. And again, that period is important because the overall non-COVID deaths are in excess for that entire period. If I add up the number of circulatory deaths for each of the weeks in this period, it will give me a net number of excess deaths in that cause of death category, and I can do that for all 5 non-COVID causes of death categories. And here are those numbers, and just to, at the risk of being tiresome, just to emphasize, it's for this period, week 21 to 43, late May through end of October. So from those curves I just showed you, this is not the total number of deaths from cancer, it's the excess, it's the number of deaths in this period relative to that period in the 5-year average. So the excess deaths from cancer in this period have been over 300. The excess deaths from dementia and Alzheimer's in this period have been almost 300. The excess deaths in this period from circulatory disease, I think is primarily heart disease and stroke, has been nearly 500. Interestingly, the net figure in this period for respiratory disease is negative, and that's in accord with what we were saying before about the fact that sadly many of the COVID deaths last year and earlier this year would have been in individuals with serious respiratory disorders, and we do expect a very significant decrease in mortality in this category as a result. Most worrying of all, I would say, is that the category other, which does not include COVID but also does not include these other 4, and so is a miscellany of many other causes of death, which would include accidents, drug overdose, suicide, and so on. As I pointed out, for all but 3 weeks in 2021, this category has shown excess deaths, and if we look only at the period, weeks 21 to 43, there have been 1,172 excess deaths in that category of cause of death alone. If we add these 5 numbers together, this will give us the excess deaths which are non-COVID for this 23-week period relative to the 5-year average, and this number turns out to be 2,110. Now there's a slightly boring but important point I should just make here. You might say, oh, couldn't we have just gotten that number in red directly by looking at this curve and just adding up these points? Now you would have gotten a very similar number to that, but a slightly smaller number, and I think for the purposes of objectivity and transparency and honesty, which are so important in this kind of discussion, I should just point out the difference. In this data here, we are subtracting what the Scottish Government calls essentially COVID-related deaths. Most of those would be deaths where COVID is deemed to be the cause of death, but there will also be a number of deaths where COVID is listed on the death certificate, but is not necessarily listed as the cause of death and would be a COVID-related death. So when we subtract that slightly larger set of deaths, we, in getting this curve then, would get a slightly smaller net number from adding up these points. It's not significantly different though, because most of the deaths that are listed as COVID related, COVID is also listed as the cause of death. But there is that
difference there, and I think the Scottish Government has gone to quite some length to also make clear that subtle difference. Because we're looking at causes of death categories here, there's no ambiguity. These are non-COVID causes of death, and the total in excess of them is 2,110 over this period, weeks 21 to 43. Now, to put that into perspective, we can say, well, how does that compare as an excess death total to the deaths due to COVID? Because they are by definition excess, because there were no COVID deaths prior to 2020, as far as we know. Well, the COVID deaths in this period, late May to end of October, are 1,317. And I think this is a very interesting and possibly quite stark comparison. So remember, this is very important, there are far more deaths than this number occurring in Scotland over this period. What we're looking at is the difference compared to the 5-year average. And so this number 2,110 is the positive excess in deaths in this period from non-COVID causes compared to the 5-year average. And as I've stressed, to the point of being tiresome, we would actually really have expected this to be a negative value for the reasons that I've explained earlier in this video. It's not negative, it's positive, and it's also not a small number. It is significantly greater than the number of COVID deaths in this period. The ratio of these two numbers is approximately in the ratio 5 to 3. So one could say that in the period late May to late October in Scotland, for every 3 individuals who sadly have died from COVID, there are 5 individuals who have died from non-COVID related causes in excess of what we would expect based on the 5-year average, and that excess has occurred every week for the last 23 weeks. So that brings me to the end of this first update video. In the next video, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into this very important period, week 21 to 43. I'm going to be doing some what's called time averaging of the data to try and make it a little bit more understandable. And this will reveal to us what I regard to be a surprising and possibly important observation.
Thank you very much for your time and interest in watching this update video. I hope you'll be able to join me for parts 2 and 3, which I'll be posting in the coming days, and which I believe will be of interest too. This is a somber topic and possibly a concerning one, but I do believe that we must look the data in the eye without flinching. We must use our wits, our honesty, our intelligence to communicate with one another so that we can understand what's driving these trends in non-COVID deaths. This, I think, will allow us to identify the underlying causes, and that's the first step in being able to reverse these trends. So with that, thank you again, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.